The humanitarian crisis playing out in Europe is almost impossible to encapsulate, much less describe in a succinct terminology. Hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing their homelands, mostly Syrians, but others from parts of Africa and South Asia. Some seeking safety, others a better way of life. So, are they refugees or migrants?
The pictures, their words, are heartbreaking. Thousands of people making a dangerous trek on foot, on cramped life rafts, and if they're lucky, by train, leaving everything they had behind, all in hopes of finding a stable place to live.
Parents pushing their children in shopping carts, carrying them on their shoulders.
They are Syrians fleeing civil war, Afghans running from the Taliban, Eritreans escaping forced labor.
Powerful images, migrant families, small children fleeing violence in their homelands.
For some news organizations, the terms migrant and refugee appear interchangeable. Graphics that say migrants, reports that say refugees.
Refugees are stranded.
It can be hard to distinguish migrants from refugees, but it makes a huge difference under international law, since refugees are asylum seekers.
We're running now with these migrants and refugees.
The river of migrants and refugees.
On-the-ground reporters like CNN's Arwa Damon and NBC's Richard Engel include both descriptives, as there are people who fit both categories. Many are migrants seeking economic opportunity, and that has a political connotation.
Hungary is letting migrants know they're not welcome here.
Migrant is a more neutral term, less politically charged than refugee. So when Hungary cages people crossing the border, they are denying everyone, not just refugees.
There are about 50,000 migrants in the country right now. The government seems to be treating this more like an invasion.
And in some ways, it is an invasion of the desperate, whatever you call them.
The first thing I want to say about this is just the spectacular reporting by both CNN and Richard Engel on this. All the networks have done a great job, but being so close to it, and I feel like I went back and looked at a lot of footage. I got to really know these refugees. I felt like I got to know their spirit and who they were, their level of education, their passion about uplifting their lives and moving somewhere else. And then I started thinking, this whole thing about what to call somebody. At some point, you have to use shorthand. You must. So choosing a more neutral term is probably the best way to go when you don't know who everybody is. On the other hand, it's become kind of like a political football, because a lot of observant groups want to say, well, call them what they are. They're refugees. Many of these people are seeking asylum. They're fleeing from violence. But yet, as I said, you've got people right on the ground doing it in both. You can't always characterize something quite so succinctly in both terms.
Well, the complexity, and this came through in some of it, is that in any one large mass, there likely could be people who are of each side. A migrant is someone who leaves, for whatever reason they're leaving, they want to go somewhere else to
they're either
have a better
displaced
life.
or
They're displaced. A refugee is someone, and the law is very clear, they have a well-founded fear of persecution if they return back home. Those people, they can't go back without perhaps being killed. So they are different people, and I can understand, as tragic as the situation is, countries have to recognize that we cannot just simply allow someone who wants to do better to come here without going through the regular process of getting a visa and so forth. So we have the same issue. I mean, we've seen this in Miami with the Cubans, and then you have Haitians.
Or Mexicans.
Haitians are always considered migrants, and Cubans are always refugees, and yet they both come in.
And Mexicans are not treated like refugees, and they should be in some cases, because they're being, because of the violence in that country.
That's right.
I think with the reporting that we've seen from places like CNN and NBC, I think that it's important, and we've seen places like the Times and others who have reporters who are dedicated to sort of following individual families or groups and their journey. And I think that makes a really important distinction. When you are writing, you have that sort of context and background, and you can say, for at least the purposes of your story, whether it is a family who are refugees or who are migrants. Going beyond that, though, I think the neutral term, obviously, when you say something like migrant, is better to use, but again, it's difficult because when the problem is once the reporting goes out into the ether and goes out and can be used in other places, if you have government agencies, you have NGOs who are using it to make decisions about how to help these groups of people, then it can become tricky if they're citing reporting.
Exactly.
But it's, you know, we have these discussions often here in the U.S., like we were talking about, obviously, with Mexicans or with Haitians and things like that. But even after something like Hurricane Katrina, which we just had the anniversary for, when we had people who were displaced because of the hurricane, we even had this discussion then, are the people who had to leave New Orleans refugees? So it's always tough when you're making a distinction about things like this.
You know, I'm with you, Emily. I have no problem with using journalistic shorthand as long as we're being respectful in the way we cover this story. I mean, let me introduce another level of complexity here. There are no refugees until they've been granted refugee status. Before that, they're asylum seekers. So, and when, you know, people coming from Nigeria are not asylum seekers. They're looking for a better economic situation. People coming from Eritrea are asylum seekers, and on it goes. So I do think that if we stick with the more neutral term migrant, we're probably on better footing, and just, you know, report on it respectfully and thoroughly and accurately, which I think the media has been doing.
Well, it is absolutely true that both groups are reflected in all of these stories, and except, as Justin said, I was looking at a CBS report, and she followed one family on a boat where it looks like the folks came and cut their fuel lines to make them, you know, go back and not come into the country. So now at that point, they were seeking better opportunity. Now are they refugees?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, because they can't go
cut
back.
afloat. Yeah,
right,
oh my
and
God,
the distinction is they cannot return if they are refugees. No, they were not refugees in Katrina because they could return. Whether they have the ability to return is something else. So we have to be careful about using the terminology. And I always say, because this language makes a difference and how we use it particularly makes a difference, that we probably all should be saying migrants, we, journalists, and then when the NGOs and the rest make their determination, so be it. But we should be using the more neutral term migrants across the board.
You know, an old phrase that seems to have fallen away was a displaced person.
Yeah. Exactly.
And there used to be displaced persons.
Well, that's a different definition.
camps.
I was looking up at all those things today. It's even yet a third definition for that. So.
Yeah, but at least that fits all. They're out of the place where they started.